Have you ever tried to read an Old English text and you've been stumped by how different the language is? You're thinking, how is this possible? How is the language so different? What has happened? In this video, I'm going to share with you the three major factors that culminated in this change, and I'm going to be explaining some minor factors at the end of the video briefly, but I'm going to do this in chronological order. So the first change that happened was the influence of Old Norse in Old English. So the Vikings began raiding England in 793 AD, but in 865 AD they actually invaded for the first time. Like, they actually had thousands of soldiers and they was trying to actually conquer it. So they weren't just trying to raid and get some money and stuff. They was actually trying to conquer it. So most of England was under Viking control for decades before the Wessex Kingdom under Aethelstan, Edward the Elder, Alfred the Great. Before they reconquered it. So during these decades of Viking control, Old Norse was being spoken within England. And what happened was basically the Old Norse that was being spoken began merging with Old English, and words that were in Old Norse began being spoken in Old English. So prominent examples are the verb to take, that's from Old English, Old Norse. To guess, that's Old Norse. Skill, that's Old Norse. Skin, that's Old Norse. And skull, that's Old Norse. And one of probably the most prominent word that's from Old Norse is the word are. So, you say you are, we are, they are. Are is from Old Norse. So the Old Norse effectively changed the verb to be, which is, I guess, the single most, the single biggest change a language can do to another language is to change its verb to be. So the Vikings had a massive impact on Old English, but I would say the biggest impact that a language did is the second change that I'm going to talk about now. And the second change was the introduction of Old French into England. So of course I'm talking about the invasion of England in 1066 by William the Conqueror. So William the Conqueror defeated the Anglo-Saxon army at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, conquered England. There was the north was technically not really under Norman control until he stamped it out in the 1070s, but we'll just say the Normans conquered England in 1066. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, William the Conqueror made a deliberate effort to remove most Anglo-Saxon nobles and replace them with Norman nobles. And why he did this was basically to have loyal Norman nobles as the most powerful nobles. So, it probably was a bit risky to have the most powerful lords, so the Earls of Mercia, Earls of Northumbria. It was a bit risky to have Anglo-Saxon nobles, nobles who had previously been loyal to Powell, Godwinson, Edward the Confessor. It was probably a bit risky to have them as the most powerful earls, because they were the nobles most likely to revolt. So William the Conqueror made a deliberate effort to remove all these Anglo-Saxon nobles and replace them with Norman ones. But that also had the effect of causing Old French to be spoken mostly within the nobility. So you start to see over the decades after the conquest Old French being spoken more and more within the nobility, and eventually Old French is basically the go-to language for any noble or prince or king. They're all speaking Old French, and Old English is left to the peasants. But within the century, so we go to the 12th century, and the 13th century, and the 14th century. During those centuries, Old French began trickling down into Old English, and it was it actually had a massive impact in Old English, way more than Old Norse, because Old Norse wasn't, I guess, as kind of important, I guess, in your face than Old French, because Old Norse was kind of like, well, I mean, it was spoken, but loads of people spoke Old English, like loads of nobles spoke Old English and everything. But I think with Old French, it was kind of stamped in, like, Old French was spoken within the nobility, and for hundreds of years, French was the dominant language of English, and Old French had a massive impact on Old English. I think there's something like 60% of words in English are from French or Latin influence, and all those words came with the invasion of England in 1066. So the French invasion of the Norman invasion in 1066 had a massive impact on English. So that was the second impact, the second change. And the third change, the final kind of major change that caused English to change so much, is time. Because languages change over time, even if they're not influenced by other languages. For example, Icelandic. Icelandic is, the island is very kind of isolated from other nations, but it's still changed from Old Norse. Of course, okay, it's very similar, but there's still words that have changed. Pronunciation has changed, words have changed, some words are, not used anymore. And even in Old English, for example, there were still words that were changing even before the Norman conquest. One only has to look at all the variations of Old English, and how if you got someone from the 5th century, and then you got another person from like the 9th century, they're not going to be able to kind of automatically, go down the pub and have 2 points or whatever. There's going to be some kind of, there's going to be some words that are not spoken, basically, by the 5th century. So there's some words that will be different in like the languages they speak, basically. So those are kind of the 3 major factors that influence English. And I would say some minor factors, so these are factors that kind of did change it, but it was like less important. I think the first one is semantic narrowing. So semantic narrowing is basically the process of words becoming kind of specific towards one thing. So for example, the word meat in Old English was referred to as basically food, just in general, like any food, like, I don't know, beef, pork, toast, bread, like, bread was considered meat. Like, it sounds strange now, of course, because, well, English has gone through semantic narrowing, but back then it made perfect sense. But what happened was basically semantic narrowing happened, and the word meat became more and more specific towards, beef, pork, food that come from animals, to the point where, if you went up to someone and showed them some bread or whatever and said this is meat, they're going to think you're a bit strange, or maybe a bit old, or perhaps, or class A, I guess. So semantic narrowing was an impact, but also I think maybe an impact changed English was kind of words becoming more like how they're said, I think. So, for example, the word fish in Old English was spelled F-I-S-C, but it was, it was still pronounced fish. Like, it was pronounced fish, but basically, it was just spelled F-I-S-K, and just over centuries it began being spelled F-I-S-H, how it's pronounced. Another word is probably the word honey. So in Old English it was spelled Hunig, but it was still pronounced honey. But over the centuries it began being written like how it's pronounced. So I think that also had an impact on the language, was kind of this kind of standardization, I guess, of spelling. Of course, there's some words that are not, you know, written as they're, or spelt as they're said. Like, for example, probably I think, learners of English have trouble with like some words that are not spelt. Like, for example, cough. It's not, it's not spelt COF. It's spelled COUGH, and it's just very confusing. So of course there are some words that are not, how they're spelt, but I'd say most of the time it's kind of, I guess, if you learn the pronunciation, it becomes easier. But of course there are some words that are different. So I would say those are the major factors that changed Old English into modern English, and why it's so hard to understand Old English as a modern English speaker. Of course, if you know other West Germanic languages like Dutch, Frisian, German, Icelandic, Icelandic's North Germanic, but I think it's easier if you know those languages, and it's probably because they have less Latin influence, so a lot of the old words were retained, but all like modernised. So those are the major factors that influence English. Hopefully I haven't, talked too much. I know it's almost 12 minutes, so maybe I've talked a bit too much, but, let me know in the comments what videos you want, about linguistics, language, etc. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.